Good evening. We're on Daf Ayin Dalid Amid Aleph, and we're up to Gufa, which we started last time, but let's review it. And nice to see Joel tonight. How are you, Joel? And with a picture, that's amazing. Mamish amazing. So let's see if we can find the place Gufa. If you count up from the bottom of Ayin Dalid Amid Aleph, approximately, I would say about 14, 15 lines. And the first word in the line is Chatzi. And the Gemara now is going back to analyze the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding Chatzi Shir. When the Torah prohibits eating something, then you've got to eat a kizayis. And if you eat less than a kizayis, what's the status? Let's say he eats half a zayis. Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion, if you recall, that Chatzi Shir also min Torah. The Torah prohibits Chatzi Shir. And Reish Lakish says, no, the Torah permits Chatzi Shir. And then the Gemara vacillates back and forth. What would Reish Lakish say? L'chatchila, is there an Isur D'Rabbanan? So Chatzi Shir, Rabbi Yochanan Amar also min Torah, Reish Lakish Amar mutar min Torah. And now the Gemara analyzes the machlokas. Rabbi Yochanan Amar also min Torah, keva dechazi litztarufe, isura ka'achel. Let's say he eats a half of zayis, and then immediately he eats the other half of the zayis of isur, the vela, treifa, whatever it might be. He is now chayav for eating a full kazayis. So when he ate half a kazayis, he was eating isur. It can't be that all of a sudden, abracadabra, when he finishes eating his kazayis, all of a sudden we're going to say, oh, he ate isur. Obviously, every segment, every morsel that he eats is asur. And we delay the chiyuv until after he finishes the kizayis. But as far as the isur per se is concerned, chazil tarufe means that every single parcel of macholas asuras, prohibited foods that he eats, is asur. Otherwise, how do you understand that when he hits the, when the bell hits the top and it goes off, he hits the kazayas, then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he violates an isur. The isur is a conglomeration. It's an amalgamation and an integration of all the different smaller parts, each one of which is asur unto itself. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan argues against Reish Lakish. How can you say that the Torah is makdir chatzi shir? It's chazil, it's tarufe. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, has a very strong counter argument. Let's hear what Reish Lakish is saying. Reish Lakish says chatzi shir is mutar min Torah. Why? Achila amar achmana. The Torah says you're not allowed to eat nevela, for example. Eating is a kazayis. Less than a kazayis does not constitute eating, according to the Torah law. In other words, every legal system has its own definitions. Within the legal system of halacha, eating, achila, is defined by a shir of kazayis. If he ate less than a kazayis, then he hasn't done a ma'isa achila, and therefore it must be mutar min Torah. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's an isur midoraisa of chatzi shir. What happens when he hits a kizayis? That's when he'll get the punishment. The onesh will be delayed until he eats an entire shir. But the isur, without a punishment, he violated when he ate a half a shir. So if a man eats half a zayis, he is asur, he's violated the isur of half a zayis. When he hits the kizayis, then he gets punished with 39 lashes, for example. Now, there's actually an analysis here of Rabbi Yochanan's concept of chazil tarufe. And in the analysis that I want to present to you, there are two possibilities as to how to understand the concept of chazil tarufe. One way of understanding chazil tarufe is what we would call a gzera. We're afraid that if we allow him to eat half of a kazayas, he may come to eat a full zayas. So we got to stop him before he gets to the finish line and he eats a whole kazayas. The other way of understanding Chazilitz Tarufe is that it's not a Gzera. Chazilitz Tarufe is a proof that every single part and parcel of the kazayas that he eats, every part and segment of the nevela is a chefta d'isura. It's something that the Torah prohibits. Araya, the proof is because of Chazilitz Tarufe. You see, in the first approach, the reason why it's asur is because of Chazilitz Tarufe. We have to prohibit half of a zayis because it might come to a full kazayas, because you can integrate the half a zayis that ate it at time T1 with the second half of kazayas that ate it at time T2. So the reason why Chatzi Shir is awesome in Torah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is because of Chazilutz Tarufe. The second approach says no. The reason why Chatzi Shir is awesome in Torah is because Chatzi Shir is also Isur. And I'm going to just prove it to you by virtue of the fact that it's Chazilutz Tarufe. The Chazilutz Tarufe is only a hochacha, a siman l'davar, that indicates, it's an indicator. It indicates that every half of a kazayas is awesome. Could be that Reish Lakish also agrees that every half of kazayas is in and of itself is awesome, but the Torah prohibited achila. The Torah said that the act of achila is prohibited. And in a Chatzi Shir, says Reish Lakish, there is no act of achila. We wonder how Rabbi Yochanan would handle the argument of Reish Lakish. What would be Rabbi Yochanan's response to Reish Lakish? And apparently, Rabbi Yochanan would say that Torah prohibits something which doesn't really constitute an achila, and that's because he's eating something that's asur. You're not allowed to eat something that's asur. And even if it's Chatzi Shir, and you won't get punished for it in the high court of Bezdin of the Jewish court, but nevertheless you are violating the Isur of eating something that's awesome. It's not an achila. Well, call it. It's not an achila as far as the onish is concerned, but it is an achila. No one's going to deny that you ate a half a zayis of nevela, and a half a zayis nevela is Isur. And I'll prove it to you because every single molecule of that makes up a full zayis is asur. And that's why you're chayav for eating a kizayis, a full shir. Now, it's interesting that there's a unique approach to Rabbi Yochanan that Chatzi Shir, Asur min Torah, Be'isur Be'alma. This is apparently the way Tosfos understands Rabbi Yochanan. Be'isur Be'alma. Let me try to explain what I think Tosfos might have in mind when he says Be'isur Be'alma. If we turn back for a moment without losing the place here on Daf Ayin Daled to the previous Amud, Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, we may remember that the Gemara quoted a Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos, Shvuah Shelo Ochal. And in that Mishnah, the Chachamim say that if he ate nevelos utreifot shkotzim v'ramosim, he's chayav. And the Gemara said, I don't understand the Rabbanan. How can he be chayav for eating nevel and treifot? He's mushpa v'yomei me'ar Sinai. He's already taken an oath at Har Sinai in joining the Isur of nevel. So the shvuah that he takes now did not register because you can't impose a shvuah on a shvuah. He's already mushpa v'yomei. there might be an answer to this question of the Gemara inherent in the phrase coined by Tosfos, as we said earlier, Iser bi'alma, meaning the following. When you eat a chatzi shir, which according to Rabbi Yochanan is a violation of the Torah law, are you culpable for eating nevela? You ate half a zayis of nevela. How do we classify that Iser? Is that Iser an Iser nevela? The Torah at Har Sinai told us lo sochlu kol nevela. And that was a reference to eating a full shear of a kezayis. But there's an Iser bi'alma called chatzi shir. Chatzi shir is an Iser unto itself. It's a brand new Iser. It does not fit into the classic, or shall we say the original Iser of nevela. I had a full kezayis of nevela. I cut it in half. And Rabbi Yochanan says that the Torah enjoins me from eating half a kezayis. Is that an Iser nevela? Maybe it's an Iser bi'alma. It's a new Iser. And the difference would be whether you apply the principle of mushpa v'omid me'ar Sinai. According to Tosfos, who says that chatzi shir is an Iser bi'alma, then there's no mushpa v'yomim mar Sinai. The mushpa v'yomim mar Sinai was on nevela. Now we have a brand new Iser, which is derived, according to Rabbi Yochanan, from the logic of chazi litztaruf. The Gemara later is going to present a slightly different source or origin for Rabbi Yochanan's conclusion that chatzi shir asur b'Torah. But be that as it may, if it's an Iser bi'alma, it is not to be subsumed or categorized on the nevela. It's not an Iser nevela. Even according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's an Iser bi'alma. So we would not apply the principle of mushpa v'yomim mar Sinai. We now understand why the Chachamim say that if a person takes a shvuah that he won't eat, and he ate nevela, he'll be chayav for that. Why? Because there's no mushpa v'yomim mar Sinai on chatzi shir. Even according to Rabbi Yochanan, although he does violate an Iser, but it's only an Iser di'alma. It's a faceless, anonymous, general Iser called chatzi shir. Now the Rambam, in the laws of Yom Kippur, Hilchas Shvitzas Asur, paskins that if a person eats or drinks chatzi shir, then makido so makas mardus. Now, what does the Rambam mean? Makas mardus, classically, is the punishment for violating an Iser d'Rabbanan. Did the Rambam choose to prefer to paskin like Reish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan? But listen carefully to the words of the super commentary on the Rambam called the Magid Mishnah. The Magid Mishnah writes, HaRambam lamad makas mardus mikal v'chomer. Me'achar v'al Iser d'Rabbanan lokin makas mardus. If you violate an Iser d'Rabbanan, let's say we paskin that milk and chicken is only d'Rabbanan. You cook milk and chicken together and you eat it, that's only d'Rabbanan. You get makas mardus. Olshkein, says the Magen Mishnah, al chatzi shir she'isuro midoraisa, certainly he gets makas mardus. So we see clearly that the Magen Mishnah understood that the Rambam was passing like whom? Don't all answer at once. Like Rabbi Yochanan, that chatzi shir is also in Torah. If you get makas mardus for violating an Iser d'Rabbanan, how much more so do you get makas mardus for violating an Iser d'Oraisa? Okay. Now let's go on. Esvei Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan now quotes a brisa, which almost explicitly, you can't deny it, contradicts Reish Lakish and clearly maintains that Chatzi Shir Osir Minat Torah. Now, this brisa is interpreting a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin. I'll read to you the pasuk. It says, Kol chelev, shar v'kesev va'ez lo sochelu. The Torah prohibits chelev of a behema. Behema includes shar, kesev, v'ez. Not chaya, for example, a tzvi, a deer, nor an oaf. There is no iser according to Torah law in eating chelev of chaya or oaf, only in the case of eating chelev of a behema. And then the pasuk continues and says, Ki kol ochel chelev min ha-behema, v'nichrasa nefesh ocheles me'amel. So the violation of eating chelev of behema incurs a chiyuv kares. The brisa says there's an extra word in this pasuk. The first word in the pasuk is kol chelev, etc. lo sochelu. And whenever we see the word kol, we know it's a ribui. Ainli ella kol sheyeshno ba'onesh yeshno bazhara. I would know, if not for the word kol, that if there's a chiyuv kares, meaning he ate a full shear, he ate something that's definitely chelev of behema, then yeshno bazhara, then he's included in the violation of the lav of lo sochelu, because at the end of the pasuk it says ki kol ha'ochel v'nichrasa. So if you're included in v'nichrasa, then you're included in lo sochelu. The Iser Achila is circumscribed to those Achilos that generate a Chiyuv Kares. However, says the Brisa, if not for the word kol, I'm going to give you two cases, two scenarios of someone who ate chelev, but he's not Chayiv Kares. The first example is called a koi. A koi is an animal, a balchai, and we don't know exactly how to classify it. We don't have any tradition as to whether it's a chaya or a behema. The man went ahead and he ate the chelev of a koi. Is he chayav or is he not? Well, I got news for you. If it's a chaya, he's not chayav. If it's a behema, he's chayav. We don't know what it is. And therefore, you can't be chayiv kares. No onesh can be imposed on a person in a case of suffix. And you don't have to be a genius to know that, because we can't punish someone in a suffix situation. What if he eats half a shear, half a kazayas of chelev, of a behema? We can't say that he's chayiv kares because he only ate half a shear. He didn't eat a full zayas. Oy, the chatzi shear whole v'edo ba'onesh, it's not included in kares because koi is a suffix chai, a suffix behema, and the Torah doesn't punish you in a case of a suffix. And chatzi shear is not called an achila. Yachol eno bazhara. I might think, says the Brisa, that since in these two categories, these two cases, there's no kares, is ipso facto, there's no iser lav, there's no azhara. Talmud loma kol chelev. That's why the Torah added the extra word kol to tell you that he violated an iser if he ate the chelev of a koi, or if he ate half a zayis of chelev. You see explicitly that chatzi shir is awesome in our Torah. And this Brisa derives that conclusion from the extra word kol chelev, the rabbos chatzi shir. how is Reish Lakish going to reconcile with this brisa? And the Gemara answers midrabanan, that what the brisa has in mind here, when it says bechlal hazhara, it means midrabanan he's considered bechlal hazhara. Ukra asmachta bi'alma. And the Chachamim, when they instituted this Isur of Chatzi Shir, they wanted to hang it on a peg, some sort of biblical word or text or pasuk that seems to indicate there is such an Isur. And they found it in the word kol. But kol is not enough to derive and teach us Chatzi Shir Asur B'Nator. Now here, my friends, I have some very important commentaries on the bottom of my Gemara, the Masechet Gemara. The first one, he says that even though an Onish Kares, even with regard to the Onish Kares, there's an extra word kol, because at the end of the pasuk it says ki kol ochel chelev, etc. So why don't we take the ribuy of kol in both the reisha and the seifa of this pasuk, and we should say that if he eats a chatzi shir of chelev, he's chayv kares. He says, kevan shetevas kol ha'amura bionesh eno amura ala chelev. The word kol in the end of this pasuk, when it says that ochel kol chelev, he ate all chelev, is v'nichrasa, that word kol, when it says kol ochel, is not coming to tell you any size of chelev, but rather any person. Men, women, gerim, I don't know, every single category of a person is included under this prohibition of kol chelev v'nichrasa. So the word kol in the last part of this pasuk is going on the person. Any person is included in this isur. Whereas in the reisha of the pasuk, when it says kol chelev, not kol ochel chelev, right? In the sefer it's kol ochel chelev, anyone who eats the chelev. In the reisha it's kol chelev, any chelev, that's coming to include chatzi shir. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, it means to include chatzi shir as an isur Torah. Now, we can even go beyond this. With regard to the sefer, the onish of kares, the Torah says, ki kol ochel chelev min behema asher yakriv mimenu isha l'Hashem v'nichrasa. What kind of chelev would generate a chiv kares? Only a chelev that's roi lakrava al gabi mizbeach. The Torah says explicitly, asher yakriv mimena isha l'Hashem. If that be the case, then we have clear-cut proof that there's no chiv kares in the cases of koi and chatzi shir, because they are not roi lakrava al gabi mizbeach. We cannot take a koi, which might be a chaya, and be makriv on the mizbech. We can't take chatzi shir and be makriv on the mizbech. We're only allowed to be makriv a full shir. The Placey, and I think the Placey was authored, if I'm not mistaken, by Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. He's a little bit bothered about the fact that the brisa connects in one breath, combines koi with chatzi shir. He asks, Madua kol on hatana biyachad. What is the connection here between koi and chatzi shir that the brisa would mention both of them in one breath? And he says the following, What is koi? Koi is when you breed an animal with a chaya. For example, a tayash with a tzviya. So the male father is a behema, and the female is a chaya. The product of that breeding, of that crossbreeding, is called a koi. And the status of the koi really depends upon another issue, which is called choshishin lizera ha'av. When it comes to animals, it's possible that the male, the father, determines the nature of the vlad. And here the father was a tayish, which is a behema. Hence, we might argue that the koi, even though the mother was a tzviya, is choshin lizera av, and therefore at least one element in the identity of this animal called a koi is a behema. Imkeni tochen shegam hu michaya v'gam behema. Perhaps both the mother, the chaya, and the father, the behema, contribute to the flesh and blood of the koi. And therefore, when you eat the kezayis of chelev, of a koi, you are basically eating a chatzi shir of chelev behema and a chatzi shir of chelev chaya, because the animal itself is half behema, half chaya. So nobody should ever think that schizophrenia is only human beings. There's schizophrenia in animals. And we have an animal that has a dual identity, Clark Kent and Superman. This animal is both a behema and a chai at the same time. If you eat a kazayis of its chelev, you're eating a half a zayis of behema, of chelev behema, and a half a zayis of chelev chaya. Is memela, we now understand clearly why this brisa combines chaya, combines koi with chatzi shir. Now, on the top of Daf Ayin Dalid Amid Aleph, there's a Tosas Divra Maskil Kevim, and he raises a very fundamental question. Initially, when Rabbi Yochanan presented his opinion, the Chatzi Shir Osam in Torah, he made it dependent upon the principle of Chazi Litztarufe. Now, we read this brisa, which is being invoked, quoted by Rabbi Yochanan, and we come to an entirely different conclusion. Rabbi Yochanan derived the origin for Rabbi Yochanan of Chatzi Shir in Torah is the pasuk Kol Chela. What is it? Is it Chazi L'Tzarufe, or is it the extra word Kol? And Tosas gives the following answer. He says, you know what? Maybe someone who's argumentative could claim that the Kol Chelev is coming to include Koi, but not Chatzi Shir. We need some sort of compelling logic to conclude that the Kol Chelev is including not only Koi, but also Chatzi Shir. What is that compelling logic? Chazi Litztaruf. The svara of Chazi Litztarufe is so compelling that if I find an extra word and I can only use that extra word as a ribui to include Chatzi Shir, then I will do so. Ilulei asvara of, if not for the logic of Chazi Litztarufe, hayamokom lomer sheikar adroshim apasuk kol chel hu lesar chelbo shel koi. Aval Chatzi Shir eino osir ela midirabanan. Aval liachar shebir Rabbi Yochanan sheish lesar Chatzi Shir mitzad asvar shel Chazi L'Tzarufe, azay yesh lomar machmas svar zu shedroshas habraisa mikol chelev lesar Chatzi Shir v'hu drosha gemura. It's a full-fledged drosha. Basically, if I want to just summarize the Tosfos, it's A plus B equals C. A is chazit sarufe. We're going to add that to the kol chelev, and that's going to produce chatzi shir osum min haTorah. And finally, we have a kasha from Chidushe Rabbeinu Moshe Mi-Imran. He asks that the Gemara says that according to Reish Lakish, Chatzi Shir is also Mirabana. That's what it says in our Gemara, Mirabana who cross Machta B'Alma. Well, if you go back to Daf Ayin Gimel, the Gemara wasn't so sure about that. The Gemara vacillated back and forth as to whether or not Reish Lakish agrees that at least Mirabana Chatzi Shir is also. So he answers that the Gemara above was not aware of this Gemara and this Makshan and this Brisa. Hatartzon lo yoda sugis haGemara kan. And it is possible at the end of the day that according to Reish Lakish, Chatzi Shir is mutar min even midrabban. But our Gemara says clearly it's also midrabban. Now, when we first learned this brisa of kol chelev, we thought for sure, black and white, we have a proof text for Rabbi Yochanan that would completely contradict the Shita Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish now defends himself and says, no, this brisa of kol chelev is only talking on a drabanan level, and the pasuk that's quoted is only an asmachta. Now at this point, Reish Lakish says, I'm going to prove to you that this brisa is operating with an asmachta. There's a compelling logic to prove, to conclude that the brisa is operating with an asmachta. If this brisa is deriving from kol chelev and isa doraisa, koi sveikahu, it's a krola suye sveika. We don't know the status of koi. Is it a behema because its father was a behema? Is it a chaya because its mother was a chaya? Is anybody going to allow you to eat the chelev of a koi? Maybe it's a behema. Let's grant that there's a 50% chance that the koi is a behema. You're going to allow a person to eat the chelev of the koi? I mean, he may be in violation of an isur karetz of chelev behema. So now we have a principle called suffix. When in doubt, leave it out. Don't eat something that might be a suffix isur, and how much more so if it's a suffix isur karetz of chelev. Why do I need a pasuk kol chelev as a ribui to include that which is obvious? We have a suffix doraisa here. This might be a behema, and its chelev is also on the chelev behema. You need a pasuk kol chelev to tell me that I'm enjoined from eating the chelev of a koi? Obviously, I can't eat the chelev of a koi. It's a suffix. Therefore, Reish Lakish says we have to assume that there's no way, no how that we need the pasuk kol chelev to derive the isur of chelev koi. It must be that this pasuk and this drasha is nothing more than an esmachta, and it's only mirabah. The truth is, Rabbosai, I'm very confused here because intuitively, I would have said the exact opposite. That this brisa clearly is deriving a doraisa. Why? Because if not for this derivation, I would have said it's a suffix. Now the brisa is teaching me that it's a vadei isur doraisa. I would have said the chatzi shir is also min haTorah. I guess the Gemara refuses my logic, maybe because since it's not included in the kares, as the Brisa says explicitly, it must be that we're not talking about a vadai isur, meaning chelev of behema. it's only a suffix. And if it's a suffix, then why do I need this drasha? Says Reish Lakish, see that this drasha is only in a smach. But now the Gemara is going to reject the logic of Reish Lakish. Why? If that's your proof, why did the Bryce have to bother with darshaning kol chelev to prohibit the chelev of a kai? If anyway it's a suffix chaya, suffix behema? No. Kasavri, the Tana of this Bryce, here we're going to turn to Daf Ayin Dalet on the page. This Tana holds that kai is a birya bifnei atzma. Whoa. We always thought that there were two possibilities regarding kai. It's either a behema or a chaya, and we don't know which. Says the Gemara, no, there's a third possibility. Kai is neither a behema nor a chaya. It's a category unto itself. And as such, maybe we're allowed to eat the chelev of a kai. It's a new entity. It's not a behema, it's not a chaya. We know that behema generates an isa chelev. Chaya does not have an isa chelev. But now we have a new category, and we don't know what the deal is as far as chelev is concerned. And that's called birya b'fnei atzma. It's not a chaya nor a behem. Now the Torah says, kol chelev, even something that's not the chelev of a behema, is also included in the Isur chelev. And what's that? It can't be a chaya. It's got to be something that's a birya b'fnei atzma, and the birya b'fnei atzma becomes part of the expanded definition of a behema as far as the Isur chelev is concerned. And the Torah with the word kol is teaching me that a birya b'fnei atzma called a kai is included under the Isur chelev. But why is the chelev of a kai, if it's being included under the expanded definition of behema, even though it's not a behema, why isn't there a chiv kares? And the answer is that this ribui is only as far as the Isra Achila is concerned. As far as kares is concerned, as we discussed earlier, it's got to be royal in Mizbeach. A kai is not royal in Mizbeach. The Torah allows behema to go on the Mizbeach. The Torah allows an oath to go on the Mizbeach, but nothing else. No other categories. Not a chaya and not a kai as a birya b'fnei atzma. So when the seifa of this pasuk stipulates that the chiv kares is conditional on the fact that this chelev is royal in Mizbeach, it excludes kai, but only as far as kares. The reisha and the first part of the pasuk that says kol chelev comes to include kai under the Isur chelev as a birya b'fnei atzma. Is there any proof, any source for birya b'fnei atzma in the case of kai? That's going to be the next part of Asuki. And this is going to be Rav Idi bar Oven. Now, in order to appreciate Rav Idi bar Oven, we need a little bit of an introduction. The Torah says in Vayikra Zayin, "V'chol dam lo sochlu b'chol moshosechem la'of u'lebehema." We are enjoined from consuming the blood of an animal, a behema, or an oaf of a bird. And there's a brisa, which is quoted in Masechet Kresos on Daf Chaf Aleph, that we're going to derive from this pasuk what's called a klal uprat. And that means that we want to, the goal or the agenda here is to derive that other animals, even if they don't fit into the category of oaf or behema, generate an Isur Achilas Dam. And that we're going to derive from a Prat Ukla. How so? Ma Prat Mefurash Davar Sheyesh Bo Tumah, Af Kol Davar Sheyesh Bo Tumah. The Torah is coming to teach us that a Davar Sheyesh Bo Tumah is included in the Isur Dam. So the Gemara asks, and what are you coming to include? If you're including Behema, which is Makabel Tumah, that's explicit in the Pasuk. If you're coming to include an oath, that's also it's also explicit in the Pasuk. So what are you deriving from the Klalu Prat that any animal that's Makabel Tumah is Asur B'Achilas Dam? We have oaf and behema explicit in the pasuk. To answer that question, we have Rav Idi Bar Ovid, that the pasuk is coming to include the dam of a koi. And not only that, if one would, heaven forbid, eat the dam of a koi, he gets kares for that. And that's derived from the prat uklal, because a koi is makabel tumah. So the Gemara now defends Reb Reish Lakish. The ilo tema hachi. If you're not going to assume, as we postulated earlier, that koi is a birya b'fnei atzma, then what are you going to do with the statement of ha the Rav Idi Bar Oven, that when the Brisa says af kol davar sheyesh bo tumah, it's coming lasuye koi, that the dam of koi is also. I don't get it. Koi sveikahu. I don't know if koi is a behema or a chaya. How can I eat the dam? Because maybe it's a behema, and dam behema is also b'achila the isur kares. Is itzra krol or abuya sfeika? Does Rav Idi Bar Oven need this klal of prat to include and extend the isur dam to a koi if a koi is a suffix behema? Ela birya. Rather, koi is an entity and a species unto itself. It's a separate category. And therefore, shiny, I don't know whether the Torah prohibited the dam of this new entity. So again, we have two possibilities here. We're going to either define koi as a suffix chai, suffix behema, and then for sure its dam is also because it might be a behema, or we're going to subsume and define koi as a biri b'fnei atzma. Then I don't even know whether the Torah prohibited its dam. The Torah prohibited dam of behema and an oath, but now we have a new birya, a new entity called koi. And for that, I need the pratu klal, deriving it from the tumah dimension. So it comes out that this brisa, which Rabbi Yochanan quoted as a raya to prove that the pasuk is coming to include chatzi shir under an isur daraisa, no proof from this brisa whatsoever. This brisa might only be an asmachta, and with regard to koi, we're talking about a birya b'fnei atzma, and the isur achilas chelev in the case of a birya b'fnei atzma, so far as we cannot classify it as behema, is a brand new isur which was instituted by the Rabbanon, and they gave an asmachta. They presented a asmachta from the word kol chelev, and if that be the case, we can apply the same to chatzi shir that's mentioned here in the same breath with koi in the brisa. and say the Chatzi Shir is only D'Rabbanan, and the pasuk is an asmach. But truth be told, this brisa is not a raya to Reish Lakish either. I think we have to be fair about it. It's certainly not a raya to Rabbi Yochanan, but it's also not a raya to Reish Lakish, because it could very well be that the Torah in the word kol is coming to include something in an Isa Doraisa, whether it be koi or even Chatzi Shir. So there's no raya here to Reish Lakish. Now, I would submit the following possibility. I have no proof for what I'm about to say, but it could be that if you hold that koi is a biri b'fnei atzma, then the halach of kol chelev, the ribui of the word kol, to include the chelev of a koi, that might be a drasha gemura doraisa. But when the brisa applies kol chelev to the case of chatzi shir, here's where Reish Lakish will claim that it's only d'Rabbanan. Again, that's not the most smooth way, the smoothest way of learning this brisa. That koi is a drasha gemura, and Chatzi Shir mentioned in the same breath in the brisa is only d'Rabbanan, and it's a smachta. That's fine. It's not exactly the way you and I would read it intuitively, but it's fine. So I'm just opening up the possibility here that Reish Lakish might agree that the word kol and the drush and the ribui from which we derive the iser chelev in the case of koi might be d'oraisa, even according to Reish Lakish. Bosai, at this point, we begin a new sugya. So if you were confused by the koi is very confusing, then listen in, tune in right now to an unbelievable brisa. Ton Rabbana. The Torah says, I'll read the whole pasuk to you, in Parshas Achremos, it says, B'chodesh hashvi'i b'asar lachodesh, ta'anu es nafsho seichem. If I translate this literally, then what it means is you should afflict pain on yourself. Now, maybe in Tibet, you can sit on pins and it doesn't bother you. I don't know. If I sat on pins, I would hit the ceiling. So does the Torah require that I sit on pins on Yom Kippur? Because ta'anuas nafsho seichem, afflict yourselves. Yochel, I might think, yeshev b'chamo. If he's sitting in the shade, he should stand up and sit in the sun. Oh, batzina, if he's sitting in the sun and he's enjoying the warmth of the sun, he should get up and sit in the cold. Kideshi yitzayir. Yitzayir means he should ma'ana himself. He should afflict suffering on himself. And the brisa now, in the most unusual way, is going to disprove that possible thesis. No. You don't have to get up and sit in the sun. You don't have to sit on pins. How do we know this? And basically what the Gemara is asking is, how do we know that v'nisem, or tanu es nafshel seichem, is not a kum v'aseh, but rather it's an iser aseh that enjoins you from enjoying life too much by eating, drinking, etc., etc. But there's no positive, active inui that's required by the Torah. How do we know that? Talmud lomar v'chol malacha lo sas. Very interesting. The Torah places two violations, one right near the other. And you know what? I have to take out a chumash. I think they're both in the same pasuk, even if I remember correctly. And it says "Tanu es nafshel seichem" and "Kol malach lo sasu." And now we're going to equate Tanuas nafshel seicha with kol malacha lo tasu. Tasu means the active element. You're not allowed to actively engage in any of the categories of labor. Is therefore ma malacha she'isur malacha b'shevi al taseh. The Torah is telling you don't actively violate Yom Kippur by engaging in malacha. Af inui nefesh. So too, the Torah is saying don't actively enjoy life and bring pleasures, bodily pleasures, according to yourself. B'shevi al taseh. You're not allowed to go out there seeking these categories of hana, of tainug, of oneg. You should be shevi alta, so you should be passive. Just like with regard to malacha, the Torah addresses you on Yom Kippur. It says, be passive. Don't be active in implementing malacha. So too with regard to inui, the Torah is enjoining you from actively seeking out bodily pleasures, but rather you are in a state of shevi altas. I never understood Rabbosai. I don't know if you see this today, or maybe you'll remember I remember this from my youth. Do you remember anything about smelling salts on Yom Kippur? Yeah, Alan's shaking his head. I mean, that's the only head I see besides my own. Maybe Joel is also shaking his head. Maybe David, maybe Brian, maybe Judy, maybe Galaxy might be Chaim. I don't know. Nobody is shaking their head except for Alan. So Alan, apparently, where are we talking about? South Africa?
Yeah, in the shul, they used to have the gentleman coming around with his smelling salts.
Yeah, in South Africa. We did it in Flatbush in Brooklyn, New York. You know, there was always this one or two guys, these smart Alex, that brought smelling salts to the shul on Yom Kippur. I once tried to smell it. I almost passed out. But I guess it's a developed taste. It's like Cabernet. It's like Merlot, I guess. So do I have to actively cause myself to suffer and smell these things until I die? Do I have to sit on pins on Yom Kippur? I think, by the way, there are people who believe that on Yom Kippur they have to force themselves to suffer more and more and more. But that's not so. So the Gemara asks, V'ema perhaps, Heicha di Yosef b'shimsha v'chaim le. If he's sitting in the sun and it's too hot for him, lo nemale kum tuv bitula. We're not going to say, stand up and sit in the shade. In other words, he's now in a state of inui because he finds himself trapped under the sun. It's hot, boiling sun. And now we should say to him, he's not allowed to actively neutralize or undermine the state of inui by picking up from the sun and going into the shade. Like imagine on a hot Yom Kippur day, the shul has air conditioning, and this shul has no air conditioning. If you're stuck in the shul without air conditioning, then shevi alta, you have to be passive and sweat it out. You're not allowed to get up and enjoy the benefit of the air conditioning. Yosef Betula, or the flip side, he's sitting in a very cold room, and he's in a state of inui. He's freezing. Lo nemale kum tuv v'shimsha. We're not going to allow him to stand up and walk into a warm room that is bathed by the sun and warmed by the sun, because we're going to tell him, shevi alta, you're in a state of an inui. You're not allowed to undermine the state of an inui by actively putting yourself in a more comfortable position. So once again, the Gemara says, let's compare it to malacha. Dumya to malacha. Ma malacha lo chilakta ba. We make no distinction as to what is malacha and what is not a malacha. Malacha is always a malacha. It's always prohibited. Af inui lo tachlok bo. Don't make any distinctions between a situation where he's already in Inui or he is moving towards Inui. And therefore, we're not going to differentiate between a case where a person's sitting in the sun, where he's sitting in a cold room, a freezing room, he's under the air conditioning, complaining about it's too cold. We don't make these distinctions. There's no mitzvah of Inui. Now, I have here a Rashash, which is one of the Achronim, and I just want to, I know we're running out of time, I just want to see if we can fit in the Rashash before we end. Rashash writes, with regard to the mitzvah of Nisam of Inui, B'chol hofanim hu mitzuva bo. Lefichach, bevadai, ein hakavana liyeshiva b'chama o b'tzina. We're not going to say that he's got to sit in the sun, he's got to sit in the cold. Shim kain nimtza she'eno mitzuva be'inui ela im kvar yoshev sham. Then you're going to say, well, he doesn't have to actively go into a hot room or sweat it out under the hot sun, but he'll fulfill the mitzvah of Inui if he's already in the hot sun. Achim eno yoshev sham, if he's not sitting in the hot sun, eno mitzvah l'sheves kidei lisanos. So now you're making a differentiation. You're saying that in scenario A, he is trapped in Inui. In scenario B, he's free of Inui. What are the two scenarios? If he's not sitting under the baking sun, he doesn't have to put himself actively. He's Shevi Alta said. But if he wants to achieve Inui, then if he happens to already be located in the hot sun, he's not allowed to move into a cooler place with his air conditioning. Then you're making distinctions between a person who's sitting outside the sun and a person who's sitting inside the sun. The person who's outside the sun, he's not obligated to move himself into the sun. The person who's in the sun is not allowed to leave the sun. Those distinctions they don't register at all, because we need a dumya de malacha. And just like in malacha, we don't make distinguishes, we don't make these categories and distinguish, so too with regard to Inui, we don't make these distinctions. L'gabi Inui ha'chila yesh chiluk v'eno mechuyev bo b'kuvaseh kigon she'eno mechuyev laniach etzbo b'fiv. Let's say he's enjoying the satiation from the food that he ate before Yom Kippur. He's not obligated to put his hand into his mouth and force himself to regurgitate. Kidei ligrom li'atzmo she'yeshuv ra'ev, so that he shouldn't feel satiated. So even with regard to the Inui of Achila, we could come up with distinctions, but the answer is no. He's not mechuyev the kuvaseh to bring himself artificially or actively into a state of Inui of ra'av, of hunger. And the Gemara is going to say that if his hands are dirty, are filthy, he might be allowed to wash them on Yom Kippur. So with regard to the Inui of rechitz, of washing, we do find a distinction. There are situations in which he's permitted to wash himself, to remove that filth. So why does the Gemara assume that we don't make any distinctions? The answer is rechitza b'makomos ha'metunafim einin nechsheves klal rechitza. When the Torah prohibits rechitza, washing, bathing on Yom Kippur because of Inui, that's only in a case of a rechitza shel tanuk, when he is bathing for pleasure. But if, on the other hand, he is bathing in order to clean himself of tinuf, to remove the filth on his body, that's not called a rechitza at all, as far as the Isur rechitza is concerned. And therefore, we come back to our original premise that we don't make any distinctions. Okay, Rabbosai, so we're here on Daf Ayin Daled Amud Beis. Let's make a note of where we got up to. Tanya Idach, which is approximately 1/3 down from the top of the Yom. So let me wish you all a great Shabbos, if I don't speak to you before Shabbos, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.